In applied statistics, regression to the mean dictates that extreme variables eventually stabilize closer to the average. Anomalies smooth out over time. In my family, however, the anomaly was the baseline. My name is Alina Delaney. I am 28 years old, I live in Seattle, Washington, and I calculate risk for a living. The variable that permanently disrupted my family's algorithm arrived on a Sunday afternoon. It was Mother's Day. I sat on my balcony overlooking the gray expanse of Puget Sound, the skyline a grid of glass and steel behind me. My phone buzzed on the metal table. It was my mother, Brenda. She skipped the customary holiday pleasantries. "Lexi's new apartment requires a guarantor," my mother stated. Her tone was brisk, carrying that familiar edge of rehearsed expectation. "The rent is steep, but it is a secure building. We ran the numbers. You can wire $3,000 a month. You make more than enough." What my mother conveniently omitted was that I had already paid my dues to Lexi's lifestyle 5 years earlier against my will. Welcome to Still Drama Stories. We explore the quiet mechanics of holding your ground when the people who share your blood try to spend your future. How old were you when you realized you were being used by your own family? Drop your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe because you will want to hear how this equation balances out. To comprehend the sheer nerve of a $3,000 monthly demand, you have to wind the timeline back 5 years. I was 23, sitting at a chipped veneer kitchen table in my parents' house back in our hometown. For decades, my parents had maintained a dedicated savings account. It held $40,000 explicitly earmarked to launch Lexi and me into adulthood. It was supposed to be a clean, even split to help with tuition or a first home. That afternoon, a paper bank statement sat open on the table. The balance read 0. My father, Tom, held the local newspaper up like a shield. His eyes were fixed on box scores he was not even reading. Brenda stood at the sink scrubbing a counter that was already clean. They had liquidated the entire sum. Every cent of my college savings, every dollar of my designated future, was gone. They drained it to cover the closing costs on Lexi's suburban starter home and to secure a lakeside venue for her wedding. "Your sister needs a foundation," Brenda said, tossing the sponge into the sink. She offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Lexi struggles. You are smart, Alina. You will manage on your own." In that kitchen, I learned the true definition of being the capable child. It was not a compliment. It was an active penalty. My competence made me the designated donor for Lexi's perpetual inadequacy. My parents looked at my grades, my work ethic, and my independence, and they decided those traits meant I required nothing. While my sister selected imported Subway tile and debated the merits of buttercream frosting for a wedding she did not pay for, I packed my things into a compact car and drove away. I took their advice. I managed on my own. I moved to Washington State, a place where the culture values self-reliance and intellect over unearned inheritance. In my new city, your worth is measured by your output, your logic, and your ability to stand on your own 2 feet. Trying to emotionally guilt-trip a professional into funding a lazy sibling's lifestyle is a cultural taboo here. But Brenda did not live in Seattle. She lived in a world where family meant endless concessions. I built my life on a diet of instant noodles and fluorescent lighting. I picked up consecutive night shifts at a logistics firm. I processed raw data entries until my vision blurred, funding my master's degree in statistics through sheer attrition. I paid my tuition, bought my textbooks, and internalized a hard lesson. My presence in my family's ledger held a value of 0. I was not a daughter to them. I was a shock absorber. I spent the next 5 years constructing a life they could not touch. Data does not care about your feelings, and a spreadsheet does not throw a tantrum. I landed a senior role as a data analyst. I bought a modern condo in a Bellevue high-rise. I put one name on the deed, mine. And now, sitting in the damp Seattle air, I listened to Brenda breathing through the phone speaker. 5 years after financing my sister's first failed domestic experiment with my stolen savings, my mother was demanding I subsidize the next one. Lexi's marriage had folded, her house was facing foreclosure, and the solution to her problem was apparently sitting in my bank account. I set my coffee cup down. The ceramic clicked against the metal table. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell at my mother about the stolen wedding fund. I just opened my laptop, pulled up a blank spreadsheet, and asked her a simple question. I stared at the screen, but what I saw was that paper bank statement from 5 years ago. I did not scream when I saw the balance read 0. Screaming is an emotional response, and emotions are unpredictable variables. Instead, I looked across the chipped veneer table and asked my mother to explain the logic. I wanted to understand the mathematical justification for erasing my half of a promised fund. Brenda did not flinch. She wiped down the faucet, turning her back to me, and delivered the sentence that would become the defining thesis of our relationship. "Your sister needs a foundation," she said. Her voice carried the light, breezy cadence of someone discussing the weather. "Lexi struggles. You are smart, Alina. You will manage on your own." I shifted my gaze to my father. Tom sat at the head of the table. He held the Sunday sports section upright, a paper barricade between himself and the theft occurring in his own kitchen. He did not lower the pages. He did not clear his throat. He just turned the page, the dry rustle of newsprint filling the silence. His silence was the final data point I needed. It cemented his role as the passive accomplice. In that quiet kitchen, the entire structure of my family crystallized into a simple, brutal equation. Lexi was the deficit forever drawing from the principal. I was the surplus expected to endure the losses without ever requesting a dividend. My competence was not a source of pride for them. It was a convenient excuse to neglect me. They relied on my silent subjugation to keep the family ecosystem functioning. If I complained, I would ruin the narrative that Lexi was a victim of circumstance who just needed a little more help. I stood up from the table. I did not ask for my money back. You cannot recover funds from an entity that feels entitled to spend them. I walked up the narrow stairs to my childhood bedroom and pulled a duffel bag from the closet. I did not waste time crying over childhood photos or sentimental trinkets. I packed with the clinical precision of a surgeon closing a wound. I rolled my clothes tight to maximize space. I stacked my statistics textbooks into 2 cardboard boxes, sealing them with heavy tape. I unplugged my laptop and wrapped the power cord into a neat coil. Every item I owned fit perfectly into the trunk and back seat of my used Honda Civic. The house was quiet when I carried my final box downstairs. Brenda was in the living room watching a home improvement show on the television. She was already planning the layout of Lexi's new suburban kitchen. She did not turn around when I walked past the couch. I opened the front door, stepped out into the humid evening air, and pulled the door shut behind me. The deadbolt clicked into place, severing the connection. I put the car in drive and aimed it west. I drove for 3 days straight, subsisting on black coffee and cheap gas station food. I watched the familiar, suffocating sprawl of my hometown fade into the rearview mirror. It was replaced by the flat expanse of the plains, the jagged rise of the Rocky Mountains, and finally the towering, rain-soaked pines of the Pacific Northwest. I was not running away. I was relocating to a highly favorable environment. I chose Seattle because it represented everything my hometown was not. Washington State is a sanctuary of intense self-reliance and high-tech meritocracy. Global tech giants dominate the skyline, their glass towers reflecting the cold waters of the bay. The culture here values raw intellect and self-made success over traditional family inheritance or emotional nepotism. If you can analyze the data, spot the trends, and produce results, you earn your place at the table. Nobody cares who your parents are, and nobody expects you to light yourself on fire to keep an incompetent sibling warm. My early days in Seattle were a masterclass in resource allocation. I rented a cramped studio apartment in a neighborhood that smelled perpetually of damp concrete and roasted coffee beans. I furnished the space with a mattress on the floor and a folding table that served as my desk. My diet consisted of instant ramen, discounted bulk rice, and loose-leaf tea. I lived on a strict budget, tracking every penny in a master spreadsheet that I updated every night before bed. That spreadsheet became my armor. The cells and formulas offered a profound sense of comfort in a city where I knew no one. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not manipulate you, and they never tell you that they spent your rent money on buttercream frosting for a wedding. If you input the correct variables, you get the correct output. I spent my days working entry-level data entry jobs and my nights applying for better positions. I refined my coding skills in the glow of my monitor until the rain tapping against my window faded into background noise. The transition was steep, but it was fair. I learned to navigate the specific cadence of the Seattle tech scene. I dressed in dark, unbranded clothing. I spoke in concise, actionable metrics during interviews. I presented myself as a low-risk, high-yield asset. Every rejection was just another piece of data telling me how to adjust my approach for the next hiring manager. The breakthrough arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. I sat in a sleek conference room overlooking Lake Union, presenting a predictive model I had built from scratch. The hiring panel asked rigorous, complex questions. They tested the boundaries of my logic, probing for weaknesses. I answered them steadily, letting the data do the heavy lifting. I did not smile to win them over. I just proved I was right. 2 days later, my inbox pinged with an official offer letter. It was a senior data analyst position at a major firm. The base salary was well into the six figures, accompanied by a robust stock option package and comprehensive benefits. I sat on my mattress, reading the numbers on the screen over and over again. The mathematical reality of that offer washed over me cold and clear. I was no longer surviving. I had achieved statistical significance. Over the next 2 years, I built a financial fortress. I moved out of the studio and purchased a modern, sleek condo in a high-rise building in Bellevue. I signed the closing documents with my own pen. The deed carried one name, my name. No co-signers, no familial strings, no hidden obligations. I furnished the space with minimalist intent, surrounding myself with clean lines and quiet colors. I maximized my retirement contributions, diversified my investments, and watched my credit score climb to near-perfect status. I created a life where every variable was under my direct control. I had designed a reality where my sister's chaotic financial failures could not touch me. Or so I thought. My phone vibrated again, the harsh buzzing pulling my focus back to the present moment. The gray waters of Puget Sound churned below my balcony. I sat at my metal table, the blank spreadsheet glowing bright on my laptop screen. Brenda was still waiting on the other end of the line, her breath crackling through the small speaker. She was waiting for me to fall back into my assigned role. She expected me to sigh, express my frustration, and ultimately ask for the routing number to wire $3,000 to her golden child. She truly believed that distance had not changed the fundamental rules of our family dynamic. I rested my fingers on the keyboard and took a slow, measured breath. I was no longer the 23-year-old girl sitting at that chipped kitchen table. I was a professional who quantified risk for a living, and my mother had just become a liability. The next 4 years unfolded in a quiet, calculated grind. I did not treat my career as a mere job. I treated it as an ongoing algorithm designed to maximize security and minimize external variables. I arrived at the office early every morning analyzing consumer data models and refining predictive algorithms for a prominent tech firm. I earned 3 distinct promotions in 48 months. Each salary bump was channeled directly into diverse investment portfolios and a high-yield savings account. I built a financial wall, brick by brick, ensuring that no one could ever leave me sitting at a kitchen table with a zero balance again. The physical manifestation of that wall was my condo in Bellevue. Situated on the 17th floor of a sleek high-rise, the property featured floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the jagged silhouette of the Olympic Mountains. The interior was a study in intentional minimalism. I painted the walls a crisp, cool white. I furnished the space with clean, functional pieces devoid of clutter. When the closing documents were slid across the mahogany desk at the title agency, I signed them with a steady hand. The deed bore one name, my name alone. There were no co-signers to claim equity and no familial strings attached to the square footage. It was a sterile, secure environment where every item had a designated place and a specific purpose. My most valuable asset, however, was not the real estate. It was my credit score and my master spreadsheet. My credit score hovered near perfection, a tangible metric of my reliability and independence. I monitored it the way a hawk watches an open field setting alerts for any minor fluctuations. The spreadsheet was my daily ritual. Every evening I logged my expenses, tracked my compound interest, and projected my net worth into the next decade. These rows and columns served as my emotional armor. They provided empirical proof that I was safe. Whenever a lingering thought of my hometown tried to surface, I opened the file. The undeniable truth of the numbers always grounded me, reminding me that math offers a specific kind of loyalty that people often lack. While my baseline stabilized and trended upward, the third layer of conflict began to simmer 3,000 miles away. The anomaly I had left behind in the Midwest started its inevitable regression to the mean. Lexi's marriage imploded just before her 3rd anniversary. I received the updates through a series of fragmented text messages from relatives I rarely saw. Her husband filed the paperwork citing irreconcilable differences, though the underlying cause was a profound inability to sustain a household built on unearned comfort. Without a partner to absorb the daily friction of adulthood, Lexi found herself solely responsible for the suburban starter home my parents had purchased with my college fund. The outcome was mathematically predictable. A person who has never learned to earn a foundation rarely knows how to maintain one. Within 14 months, the missed mortgage payments compounded. The bank issued warnings, then formal demands, and finally a notice of foreclosure. The house featuring the imported subway tile and the manicured lawn was seized by the lender. The $40,000 stolen from my future vanished into bank penalties and legal fees, yielding a total return of zero. As Lexi's financial infrastructure collapsed, Brenda's communication strategy evolved. The calls shifted from sparse, passive-aggressive updates about local weather to targeted probing. My mother possessed a unique talent for disguising interrogations as casual conversation. She wanted to know the exact parameters of my success. "It must be so expensive to live in a city like Seattle," Brenda remarked during a Tuesday evening phone call. "I saw on the local news that groceries out there cost a fortune. How do you manage your budget on a single income?" I recognized the bait immediately. She was fishing for a vulnerability, a crack in the armor she could exploit, or at the very least a raw number she could use to calculate my surplus. I employed a psychological technique known as gray rocking. You become as uninteresting and unresponsive as a plain gray rock offering no emotional footholds. "I managed just fine," I replied. My tone was flat, devoid of inflection. "Well, you must be getting regular bonuses at that fancy tech company," she pressed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Are they taking good care of you?" "The compensation is fair for the market," I stated. I offered no digits, no percentages, and no complaints. I gave her a brick wall of corporate jargon. The conversation stalled, suffocated by a lack of usable data. These interactions highlighted a stark cultural contrast between my chosen home and my hometown. In Bellevue and Seattle, I was surrounded by peers who valued raw intellect, strict logic, and self-made success. My colleagues discussed optimization, compound interest, and professional boundaries over lunch. If a coworker walked into the break room and announced they were expected to sacrifice their hard-earned salary to fund a capable, healthy sibling's rent, they would be met with profound confusion. In this high-tech meritocracy, attempting to emotionally guilt-trip a successful professional into subsidizing a lazy relative is a cultural taboo. We build our own safety nets here. We do not demand others weave them for us. Brenda, however, operated under a different paradigm. To her, my independence was not an achievement to be celebrated. It was a resource hoarding issue. As the reality of Lexi's foreclosure settled in, the tension in Brenda's weekly calls ramped up. The subtle probing transformed into overt comparisons designed to manufacture guilt. "Lexi is having to downsize," Brenda sighed loudly into the receiver one afternoon. "She is looking at these tiny, cramped apartments on the edge of town. It breaks my heart to see her struggle so much when she deserves a nice space." She paused, waiting for the silence to do the heavy lifting. When I provided no response, she tightened the screws. "It just seems so unfair. You have that huge modern condo all to yourself in the city. So much space for just one person. It must feel lonely having all that room while your sister is losing everything." The manipulation was transparent. She wanted me to feel ashamed of my success. She wanted me to apologize for the square footage I had purchased with my own wages. "The condo is the exact size I require," I answered. I did not apologize. I did not offer Lexi a spare key. I maintained the boundary with clinical precision, letting the uncomfortable silence stretch across the phone line until Brenda eventually changed the subject. I refused to accept the premise that my stability was somehow responsible for Lexi's instability. I had built a fortress, and I was not going to lower the drawbridge just because someone else had burned their own castle to the ground. I believed my physical distance and my verbal discipline were sufficient to protect me. I thought that by withholding my emotional reactions and my financial data, I had successfully neutralized the threat. That was an error in calculation. I had underestimated the sheer velocity of their entitlement, which brings the timeline current syncing the past with the exact moment the variables turned hostile. I sat on my balcony, the cool Pacific breeze lifting the edges of my hair. The skyline gleamed against the gray clouds. My phone sat on the metal table, the screen dark and silent. Then the glass surface vibrated. The device buzzed, signaling an incoming call. The caller identification flashed across the screen. It was Mother's Day. The quiet grind of the past few years was over, and the primary conflict was about to breach my front door. The device buzzed against the metal table, the vibration humming through the steel grating of my balcony. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. It was the second Sunday in May. I picked up the phone out of strict calendar obligation. Answering was a calculated gesture to maintain the baseline, a minor expenditure of time to prevent a larger dramatic sequence later. I swiped the screen and pressed the speaker to my ear. I offered a standard holiday greeting. Brenda answered with a voice soaked in artificial sugar. The tone was rehearsed, a high-pitched modulation she reserved for church functions and asking for favors. She wished me a beautiful morning. She asked about the weather in Seattle, pretending to care about the cloud cover over the Pacific Northwest. I gave her the meteorological facts. I waited. Brenda never called merely to check the barometric pressure. The small talk was a Trojan horse, and I could already hear the hollow wooden wheels rolling toward my boundary lines. The pivot arrived precisely 2 minutes into the conversation. Her voice dropped half an octave, shifting into a register of manufactured concern. She transitioned from the weather to my sister. Lexi had endured such a difficult year, Brenda explained. The foreclosure had been a devastating blow to Lexi's fragile emotional state. Moving into a cramped, low-income complex would simply break her spirit. Lexi deserved a space where she could heal, a place that felt secure and elevated. Brenda then introduced the solution she had unilaterally devised. Lexi had toured a luxury apartment complex in the upscale retail district of our hometown. The building featured a concierge-secured garage parking and modern amenities. It was the perfect environment for a fresh start. There was only one minor logistical hurdle. The rent was steep, and Lexi did not possess the credit score or the income to qualify on her own. This was the moment the trap sprang shut. Brenda did not ask for my opinion on the matter. She presented a finalized invoice. "We ran the numbers," my mother said, her voice regaining its brisk, confident edge. "Your father and I are on a fixed income, but you have that senior director salary now. You make more than enough to cover the gap. We calculated that you can easily wire $3,000 a month for the lease. It will not even make a dent in your lifestyle." I listened to the steady sound of the wind coming off the water. The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the damp air. Brenda had spent the last several months probing for my financial data, and she had used those estimated figures to budget my sister's luxury living arrangements. $3,000 a month equaled $36,000 a year, over a standard lease term that was a staggering sum of capital to set on fire. "It is just what family does," Brenda continued, filling the silence when I did not immediately agree. "Family steps up when someone is down. We do not turn our backs on family. You have so much, Alina. Lexi has nothing right now. Family shares the blessing." She wielded the word family like a blunt instrument. It was her favorite tactical weapon. In her vocabulary, family meant a designated hierarchy where the responsible members bled themselves dry to insulate the irresponsible members from the consequences of their own actions. I ran the opportunity cost of her request through my head. $36,000 a year invested in a standard index fund with a moderate annual return, compounded over a decade, represented a significant chunk of my early retirement plan. Brenda was asking me to forfeit my future stability to fund Lexi's present comfort. I leaned back in my chair. I did not feel a spike of adrenaline. I did not feel the familiar childhood urge to shrink or accommodate. I viewed her demand through the lens of a statistician evaluating a business proposal. "You are asking me to initiate a recurring monthly transfer of $3,000, I said. My voice was calm, mirroring the temperature of the gray sky above me. "You want me to fund a luxury lease for an individual with zero reliable income and a documented history of default." "She is your sister," Brenda snapped. The artificial sugar in her tone began to dissolve. "She is a terrible investment," I corrected. "From a purely analytical standpoint, you are asking me to sink $36,000 a year into a 100% loss-yielding asset. There is no return on that expenditure. It is just financial hemorrhage disguised as sibling duty." The line went dead quiet for 3 seconds. I could hear the sharp intake of Brenda's breath. When she spoke again, the polite matriarch facade shattered entirely. Her voice turned vicious, dripping with a toxic mixture of resentment and entitlement. "You are a selfish, cold-hearted elite," Brenda hissed. The words flew through the speaker like shrapnel. "You sit up in your expensive glass tower in your liberal city and look down on the people who raised you. You think your spreadsheets make you better than us. You have abandoned your own blood for money." She waited for the insult to land. She expected me to defend myself, to cry, to argue that I was not cold-hearted. That was the old script. But I no longer participated in that play. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with her emotional theatrics. I stayed rooted in the unarguable logic of the situation. A lack of planning on Lexi's part does not constitute an automatic withdrawal from my accounts, I said. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I tapped the red circle on the screen. The call disconnected. I set the device face down on the table. The sudden silence on the balcony was profound. For the first time in my life, Brenda had lost verbal control over me. She had deployed her heaviest guilt tactics, and they had bounced off my perimeter without leaving a scratch. I did not cry. I did not feel a shred of guilt. What I felt was a clarifying coldness. The math was finally balanced. They had spent my college fund, and in exchange they had purchased my permanent absence from their financial crises. The transaction was complete. I picked up my coffee mug and took a slow sip. The dark roast was bitter and grounding. I looked out at the boats navigating the choppy waters of the Sound, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction in my own self-reliance. I had successfully defended my fortress. The boundary had held. I was safe from their financial ruin. Then my phone screen lit up against the metal table. I assumed it was a retaliatory text message from Brenda. I expected a long paragraph detailing my perceived moral failures, perhaps a threat of being uninvited to future family gatherings. I had no intention of attending anyway. I picked up the device and flipped it over, prepared to block her number if she continued the harassment. It was not a text message from my mother. It was an automated email notification. The banner at the top of the screen displayed the logo of my premium credit monitoring service. I opened the application. A red alert symbol pulsed next to a new notification. A hard inquiry had just been pulled on my Social Security number. I read the text of the alert carefully. The inquiry had not originated from a bank in Seattle. It had not come from my mortgage lender or my primary credit card issuer. It had originated from a luxury property management company located exactly 3,000 miles away, right in the heart of my hometown. I stared at the glowing red icon on my screen. The average person might feel a surge of panic in this scenario. They might experience an elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, or an immediate urge to dial their mother and demand an explanation. I experienced none of those things. I am a statistician, and in my profession, a sudden spike in a metric is not a reason to panic. It is a reason to audit. When you work with complex data sets, you learn to treat anomalies like a trauma nurse treats a fresh wound. You do not flinch. You put on gloves, you stop the bleeding, and you assess the damage with clinical detachment. I set my phone back on the metal table and pulled my laptop closer. I opened a secure browser and logged directly into my primary credit monitoring portals. I bypassed the summary dashboards and went straight to the raw data files, pulling the most recent inquiry reports from all 3 major bureaus. There it was, logged exactly 14 minutes after I disconnected the phone call with Brenda. A hard inquiry from Oak Haven Property Management, a high-end leasing conglomerate based in the affluent retail sector of my hometown. My mother had not called me to ask for my permission. She had called me to inform me of a transaction she was already executing. When I declined to fund Lexi's lifestyle voluntarily, Brenda simply bypassed my consent and proceeded to volunteer my financial identity. I opened a new tab and searched the property management company. I navigated to their floor plans and pricing tiers. Lexi had not applied for a modest one-bedroom unit. She had selected a premium corner suite with panoramic views and upgraded fixtures. The base rent was listed at $4,000 a month. The mathematical reality of their deception was staggering. Brenda had asked me to wire $3,000, implying that Lexi would somehow cover the remaining $1,000. But by inserting my Social Security number and naming me as the primary guarantor on the application, Brenda had legally bound me to the entire lease. $48,000 in annual baseline rent, plus utilities, security deposits, and any potential damages my sister inevitably accrued. They were attempting to chain me to a $500,000 liability over the next decade. This was the moment the nature of our conflict fundamentally shifted. We were no longer engaging in a toxic family dynamic. We were no longer debating the ethics of familial obligation or boundary setting. Brenda and Lexi had crossed a very specific, undeniable line. They had transitioned from emotional manipulation to felony-level identity theft. I want to pause here and address you directly, especially if you have ever found yourself dealing with people who view your boundaries as mere suggestions. There is a profound danger in reacting emotionally when the law is firmly on your side. If you catch a thief in the act of stealing your assets, the worst tactical error you can make is to call them and scream. Screaming alerts them. It gives them an opportunity to cancel the application, deny the intent, and spin a new narrative where you are the hysterical, paranoid antagonist. Silence, however, is a net. If you stay quiet, they will continue to walk forward until they are standing squarely in the center of the trap. I did not call my mother. I did not send an angry text message to my sister. I kept my breathing even and began the methodical process of locking down my life. I clicked through the security settings on my credit portals. I placed an immediate hard freeze on my Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion files. I activated fraud alerts across all my banking institutions. Within 5 minutes, my financial identity was encased in digital concrete. Nothing could be opened, approved, or finalized without my direct multi-factor authorization. Once the perimeter was secure, I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Oak Haven Property Management. It was Sunday afternoon, but luxury leasing offices maintain weekend hours to capture eager prospective tenants. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was bright, polished, and eager to close a deal. Oak Haven Leasing, this is Sarah. How can I help you find your perfect home today? Hello, Sarah, I replied, keeping my cadence professional and unhurried. My name is Alina Delaney. I am calling regarding a rental application submitted to your office roughly 30 minutes ago. Oh, yes, Sarah said, the typing of her keyboard echoing softly over the line. I have the file right here, Lexi Delaney for the 2-bedroom corner suite. We were just reviewing the guarantor information. I see you are listed as the primary financial backer, Alina. We appreciate your promptness. I am not the financial backer, I stated calmly. I am calling to inform you that the application you are currently processing is fraudulent. I did not apply for a lease, I did not authorize the use of my social security number, and I will not serve as a guarantor for Lexi Delaney. The typing stopped instantly. The cheerful customer service persona dissolved, replaced by sudden, palpable hesitation. Fraudulent, Sarah stammered. But we received a fully signed guarantor agreement. It has your digital signature and all your verified identification numbers. Someone in possession of my personal data submitted that form without my consent. I explained, letting the gravity of the federal crime settle over the conversation. I have already frozen my credit profiles and initiated a fraud alert. I strongly advise you to flag that specific application and halt all processing immediately. Approving it will result in a significant legal liability for your management company. I will red flag the file right now, Sarah assured me, her voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. I am so sorry this happened, Ms. Delaney. We take identity fraud very seriously. I know you do, I said. Before we disconnect, Sarah, I need you to perform one specific action for me. I need a copy of that entire application package. I need the IP address it was submitted from, the timestamps, and the forged guarantor agreement forwarded to my email address for my personal records. I am compiling evidence for the authorities. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, likely running through her corporate privacy protocols. But the mention of the authorities and the undeniable fact that it was my stolen data on the forms compelled her to comply. She verified my email address and sent the files before we ended the call. I opened the secure email attachment on my laptop. The document was a standard legal lease agreement. There at the bottom of the final page was my name. Someone had used a digital cursive font to type my signature on the guarantor line. It was a clumsy, lazy attempt at forgery, executed by people who truly believed they would never face consequences because family members do not press charges. They had relied on the assumption that my lifelong conditioning to keep the peace would override my instinct for self-preservation. They thought I would simply pay the rent to avoid a scandal. I connected my laptop to my wireless printer. The machine whirred to life, spitting out crisp black and white copies of their felony. I gathered the warm sheets of paper and walked into my home office. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a sterile, blank manila folder. I placed the forged application, the timestamps, and the credit inquiry alert inside the folder. This was my immutable paperwork shield. In a world where toxic relatives try to twist every spoken word into a weapon, physical documentation is the only reliable defense. You cannot gaslight a printed IP address. You cannot guilt-trip a forged signature on a legal contract. The folder represented the cold, hard data I needed to neutralize their emotional warfare. I set the folder squarely in the center of my desk. I felt a profound sense of clarity. The ambiguity of my family dynamic was gone, replaced by a straightforward equation. They had committed a crime, and I held the evidence. I walked back to the kitchen to refill my coffee mug. Just as I poured the dark liquid, my phone screen illuminated on the counter. A text message banner flashed across the top. It was from Brenda. She had no idea that her application had been flagged. She had no idea that I held copies of her digital forgery. She was operating under the delusion that her plan was progressing flawlessly, and she was already moving to the next phase of her manipulation. I leaned against the granite counter and read the short, arrogant message. "We are coming to Seattle next week for a family visit. We need to talk." I replied to my mother's text message with a single word. Yes. Inviting a hostile force into your stronghold goes against basic tactical survival. But my condo was a controlled environment. I had the home field advantage. I understood every variable within my own walls. A week passed in a quiet blur of corporate data models and predictive forecasting. I finalized my quarterly reports at work. I prepared the guest room with fresh linens. I waited. Friday evening arrived with a steady driving rain. The lobby concierge called up to my unit to announce my guests. I met them at the door of my 17th floor unit. Brenda dragged 2 oversized suitcases over the threshold, her breath heavy from the short walk down the carpeted hallway. My father, Tom, trailed behind her carrying a garment bag and looking anywhere but at me. Lexi walked in last. She held an iced coffee and sighed loudly, acting as if the elevator ride had drained her final reserves of energy. Their presence immediately shifted the atmospheric pressure in my home. They brought a chaotic, demanding energy that clashed violently with the quiet sanctuary I had built. My condo is a study in clean lines, neutral tones, and intentional empty space. Brenda surveyed the living room with visible distaste. She dropped her heavy purse onto my white leather sofa. "It feels so cold in here, Alina," she declared, gesturing toward the unadorned walls and the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ferry terminal. "You make all this money and you live like a monk. Where are your family photos? Where is the warmth?" I did not defend my interior design choices. I offered them glasses of water. Lexi bypassed the kitchen entirely and wandered down the hallway. She opened the door to my master suite. "Oh, the view in here is great," Lexi announced. She walked straight in and dropped her heavy tote bag onto my pristine duvet cover. Brenda quickly followed her favored daughter into the room. Brenda turned to me with a bright, expectant smile. "Lexi has been under immense stress with the foreclosure," Brenda said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "She needs a place to truly relax and decompress this weekend. You can sleep in the guest room. It is only fair since you have this space all to yourself every other day of the year." I stood in the doorway. I did not raise my voice, nor did I attempt to negotiate. Negotiation implies that the other party holds leverage. "That is my bedroom," I stated. "The guest room is the second door on the left. You will sleep there, or you will book a hotel room downtown. The choice is yours." Lexi scoffed, crossing her arms and rolling her eyes at the ceiling. Brenda frowned, her jaw tightening as her first attempt to establish dominance failed. She was used to me folding under the slightest pressure. "You have always been so rigid," Brenda muttered, pulling Lexi's bag off my mattress. They retreated to the guest quarters. I closed my bedroom door until the latch clicked tight. The tension thickened as the evening progressed into Saturday morning. Brenda refused to sit still. She paced through my home, running her fingers over the quartz countertops and inspecting the labels on my appliances. I watched her audibly calculate my net worth. She asked what the monthly homeowners association fees were. She inquired about the price per square foot in Bellevue. Every question was a thinly veiled inventory of my assets. She was doing the math, figuring out exactly how much surplus I possessed, so she could justify the luxury lease application she believed was still being successfully processed in our hometown. Tom found the television remote and settled into an armchair, turning on a golf tournament. He became a fixture of silence, enabling his wife's behavior by refusing to acknowledge it. I stepped into the kitchen to prepare coffee. I stopped in my tracks. The cabinet doors were wide open. Brenda stood on her tiptoes, moving my ceramic mugs from the bottom shelf to the top shelf. She was shifting my plates to the left side and my bowls to the right. "These cabinets made no sense," Brenda announced over her shoulder, noticing my arrival. "I am organizing them for you. A proper kitchen needs a proper flow. You just put things wherever they fit, but there is a system to these things." This was a classic boundary test. It was a physical manifestation of her need to control my environment. She wanted to prove that even in my own home her rules superseded mine. I did not argue with her. I did not ask her to stop. I simply walked over to the counter, reached up, and took the mugs from the top shelf. I placed them exactly where they had been before she touched them. I moved the plates back to the right and the bowls back to the left. I performed the task in total silence, matching her every move in reverse. Brenda watched me, her face flushing with a deep shade of red. She closed her mouth tight. She realized her physical encroachment had been neutralized without a single word spoken. Later that afternoon, the true purpose of their visit revealed itself. Tom was still watching television, and Lexi was taking a nap in the guest room. Brenda cornered me by the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room. She folded her hands in front of her. "We need to have a serious family meeting tonight," Brenda said. Her voice carried a smug, victorious tone. "We are going to discuss Lexi's living situation, and we are going to finalize the plans for the new apartment. We are going out for dinner at that nice seafood restaurant on the waterfront to celebrate." I looked at her, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "I have no plans to celebrate," I replied. Brenda smiled. It was a predatory, confident smile. "You will want to be on your best behavior tonight," she purred, taking a step closer. "I took the liberty of looking up your company online. I found your senior director, Diane, on a networking site. I sent her a lovely message introducing myself as your mother. I invited her to join us for dinner tonight. She accepted." The sheer scale of her miscalculation washed over me in a wave of cold clarity. Brenda had invited my mentor, a veteran executive in the Seattle tech industry, to our family dinner. Brenda's strategy was obvious. She intended to use my professional circle as a weapon against me. In Brenda's mind, a boss functioned like a church elder or a community busybody. She assumed Diane would enforce familial compliance. She thought she could shame me into submission, forcing me to agree to the financial extortion to save face in front of a senior colleague. She wanted a captive audience to witness my surrender. I looked out the window at the gray waters of the Sound. Diane was a woman who navigated corporate mergers and handled hostile takeovers before lunch. She evaluated people based on their ability to manage risk and enforce strict boundaries. Brenda had no idea what kind of environment she had just invited herself into. She was attempting to play a game of emotional checkers against a grandmaster of corporate chess. I turned back to my mother. "Dinner is at 7, I said softly. "I will make the reservation." Brenda beamed, convinced she had won the war. She walked away to get dressed, completely unaware she had just finished building her own gallows. The day of the dinner arrived with a heavy, persistent drizzle sweeping across the Seattle skyline. I submitted a half-day request to my department head and logged off my workstation at noon. I did not take the afternoon off to fret-pace the hardwood floors of my condo or practice a speech in front of a mirror. Emotional preparation is a waste of resources when you are dealing with a hostile variable. I needed the hours to finalize my documentation. I drove my vehicle through the gray afternoon traffic to a local police precinct in the downtown district. The municipal building smelled of industrial floor wax and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the filtered air of my corporate office. I approached the front desk and spoke with the duty sergeant. I explained my situation with strict clinical detachment, presenting my driver's license and proof of residence. I handed him the printed emails from the property management company, the digital timestamps, the IP address logs matching my parents' home router, and the lease application featuring my forged signature. The sergeant reviewed the paperwork, his expression shifting from routine boredom to sharp attention. He asked if I intended to press charges today. I instructed him to file the official report for identity theft and fraud, but I requested to leave the activation of those charges pending. A pending criminal charge is a lever. An active charge is a released spring. I needed the lever for the evening ahead. The sergeant filled out the necessary forms and stamped the final page with blue ink. That sound, the heavy throb of a metal stamp hitting paper, signaled the closing of a long, toxic loop. I thanked him, collected my documents, and walked back out into the rain. Returning to my high-rise, I sat at my home desk and pulled out the sterile manila folder. I placed the freshly stamped police report inside the left pocket. Beside it went the forged luxury lease documents. Finally, I added a new file I had generated that morning. It was a single-page, highly detailed spreadsheet charting the $40,000 drained from my designated savings account 5 years prior. I had calculated the lost compound interest adjusting for a standard 8% annual market return over the elapsed time. The final number on the bottom row represented the exact financial deficit my family had imposed on my life. The folder was no longer just a defensive shield against their current extortion attempt. It was a comprehensive, undeniable audit of their historical theft. Let me pause here and speak directly to you. Society often misinterprets the psychology of a calm woman. People tend to assume that silence equates to submission. They believe that if you do not scream, cry, throw objects, or defend your character loudly, you are inherently weak and easily conquered. That is a fundamental error in judgment. True power is never found in raising your voice to match the chaos of an unstable room. True power is holding a royal flush while watching your opponent push their entire life savings into the center of the table on a pair of twos. You do not interrupt their grandstanding. You let them build the pot. You let them experience the intoxicating thrill of their own arrogance. You allow them to construct a narrative of victory so tall that the inevitable fall shatters their illusion upon impact. If anyone has ever accused you of being too quiet during a confrontation, remember that noise is just a byproduct of insecurity. Verified data requires zero volume. I closed the folder and walked into my bathroom to prepare for the evening. I did not dress in defensive armor. I chose my standard sharp professional attire. I selected a tailored charcoal blazer, a crisp white silk blouse, and dark trousers. I pinned my hair back into a severe polished knot and applied minimal makeup. I looked into the mirror and saw exactly what I intended to project to the room. I was not a daughter attending a family reunion to beg for scraps of approval. I was a senior statistician about to deliver a finalized risk assessment to a hostile board of directors. I ordered a private car service to transport Brenda, Tom, and Lexi from my building to the waterfront. I drove my own vehicle, arriving at the seafood restaurant 15 minutes early. The establishment sat on a wooden pier extending over the dark, churning waters of Puget Sound. The interior featured dim, ambient lighting, white linen tablecloths, and the low, steady hum of expensive conversations. I requested a secluded circular booth near the back windows, ensuring privacy for the transaction ahead. I sat down and placed the manila folder on the empty leather seat beside my thigh, hidden from immediate view. My family arrived shortly after. Brenda walked into the dining room like a conquering monarch surveying her new territory. She wore a bright floral dress that clashed loudly with the subdued Pacific Northwest aesthetic. Lexi trailed behind her, checking her phone and looking distinctly bored by the ambiance. Tom brought up the rear, his shoulders hunched, avoiding eye contact with the host who guided them to my table. 5 minutes later, Diane walked through the front doors. My mentor commanded the space effortlessly. She wore a structured black trench coat and carried an aura of practiced, undeniable authority. Diane had climbed the corporate ladder in a male-dominated tech industry through sheer resilience and razor-sharp intellect. She did not suffer fools, and she harbored a profound distaste for unearned entitlement. I had briefed Diane earlier that week regarding the basic parameters of this dinner. She knew enough to understand her presence was being weaponized against me. She had agreed to attend out of sheer curiosity and a protective instinct for a favored colleague. Brenda spotted Diane immediately. My mother rushed forward before Diane even reached the booth, extending both hands. Her face stretched into a radiant, performative smile. Brenda introduced herself, radiating artificial warmth. She thanked Diane profusely for taking the time to join our intimate family gathering. Brenda played the role of the loving, concerned matriarch flawlessly. She touched Diane's arm, projecting the image of a mother who only wanted the best for her daughters, subtly implying that I was a workaholic who needed familial guidance. Diane accepted the greeting with a polite, measured nod, her sharp eyes cataloging every micro-expression on my mother's face. We took our seats at the circular booth. Brenda maneuvered herself into the center position, flanking Diane on one side and Lexi on the other. I sat directly across from my mother. The waiter poured sparkling water and handed out heavy, leather-bound menus. Brenda beamed at the table, her chest puffed out with smug confidence. She surveyed the expensive glassware and the sweeping view of the harbor lights reflecting on the water. She genuinely believed she had orchestrated a masterstroke. Brenda thought she had cornered me in an upscale public setting surrounded by my professional hierarchy, leaving me no choice but to surrender to her financial demands to avoid a humiliating scene in front of my boss. She picked up her water glass, her eyes locking onto mine with a triumphant predatory gleam. The trap was fully set and my mother was sitting right on the trigger. The waiter arrived at our secluded circular booth carrying heavy silver trays. He distributed plates of seared halibut wild mushroom risotto and roasted root vegetables with practiced efficiency. The clinking of fine silverware against porcelain provided a steady rhythmic background track to the performance unfolding at the center of the table. My mother was squarely in her element. She held court with the bright, practiced ease of a seasoned politician running a local campaign. Brenda spent the first portion of the meal charming Diane. She spun fabricated stories designed to paint a portrait of a deeply connected, tight-knit household. She recounted fictionalized versions of summer camping trips we never took, and holiday baking traditions that never actually occurred. She crafted a narrative where our family was a unit built on mutual support and unconditional loyalty. I did not interrupt her fiction. I let her speak freely. I picked up the chilled bottle of Sauvignon Blanc from the silver bucket beside the table and poured the wine. I filled Diane's glass first, then my mother's, and finally Lexi's, moving with quiet grace. I played the role of the attentive, dutiful host, observing the variables align exactly as I had predicted. Diane proved to be a masterful, silent participant. She offered polite smiles and nodded at appropriate intervals, sipping her wine, while her sharp eyes tracked the subtle shifts in posture around the booth. She listened to Brenda's curated history without offering any personal data in return. As the main courses were cleared and the table was reset for coffee, Brenda initiated her pivot. She needed to transition the conversation from nostalgic fiction to the current financial objective. She accomplished this by introducing the concept of my sister's recent life events, softening the edges of reality to fit her narrative. Lexi had always possessed a unique talent for outsourcing her failures. If she forgot a homework assignment in grade school, she blamed the teacher for poor instructions. If she incurred a late fee on a credit card, she blamed the postal service. Brenda now applied this same framework to a foreclosed mortgage and a collapsed marriage. Lexi has encountered some unexpected turbulence recently, Brenda said, her voice dropping into a soft, maternal register. She reached out and patted Lexi's hand. It is just a season of transition. We all face temporary hardships. Sometimes the world hands you a difficult hand, and you just have to lean on the people who know you best to weather the storm. Brenda made it sound as though Lexi had been struck by a rogue lightning bolt, rather than having systematically avoided fiscal responsibility for an entire decade. Lexi played her part perfectly. She lowered her gaze, stirring her coffee with a small silver spoon. She offered the table a brave, fragile smile, acting the part of the weary traveler seeking refuge. The sixth layer of conflict ignited moments later. Brenda checked her posture, sitting up a fraction of an inch straighter. She picked up her crystal water goblet. Extending a manicured fingernail, she tapped the rim of the glass twice. The sharp, clear chime cut through the ambient noise of the dining room, demanding the attention of everyone at the table. We have some family business to discuss, and since Diane is such an important part of Alina's life here in Seattle, we consider her a friend of the family, Brenda announced. She turned her beaming smile toward me. We are just so proud of Alina. She has been so blessed in this city. Seattle has given her so much opportunity, and she has built a wonderful, comfortable life for herself. I noted her specific choice of vocabulary. The word blessed is a highly effective tool for erasure. It implies that my high-rise condo, my senior title, and my investment portfolio were bestowed upon me by a generous universe. It conveniently deletes the years of surviving on instant noodles, the consecutive night shifts, and the relentless data processing required to earn my position. By framing my success as a blessing, Brenda was preparing to argue that I had an unearned surplus that I was morally obligated to share. Because we are such a close family, we do not make major decisions in a vacuum. Brenda continued, her voice projecting across the table. We held a family meeting before we flew out here. We took a vote on how to best handle Lexi's temporary hardship. The concept of a family vote was a fascinating piece of psychological theater. Three adults living 3,000 miles away had held a democratic election to determine the allocation of my personal wages. They had formed a voting bloc to decide what to do with a bank account they did not contribute to. The vote was unanimous, Brenda stated. We decided that because Alina has been so blessed, it is her duty to step in as the financial guarantor for Lexi's new life. It is time for her to share the foundation she has built. Lexi found a beautiful, safe apartment, and Alina is going to secure the lease. Brenda then executed her primary tactical maneuver. She turned her attention away from me and focused entirely on Diane, weaponizing my mentor's presence to seal the trap. "You understand how it is in the corporate world, Diane," Brenda said, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial knowing register. "You know how it is in our culture. We take care of our own. Alina is brilliant with numbers, but sometimes she can get a bit tunnel-visioned on her career. She just needs a little push to do the right thing for her loved ones. I am sure you see the value of family loyalty." The dynamic at the table crystallized into a static tableau. Lexi looked across the white linen tablecloth at me. Her expression held an expectant, unearned arrogance. She was already visualizing the keys to a luxury corner suite. Tom shrank into the leather upholstery of the booth. He stared intently at a discarded lemon wedge on his bread plate, chewing his inner lip. He recognized the boundary his wife was crossing, yet he chose cowardice over intervention. Diane remained silent, her hands resting calmly on the table, watching me to see how I would handle a hostile board. Brenda waited for my reaction. She expected one of two outcomes. The first was that I would blush, stammer, and fold under the pressure of being called out in front of my senior director, agreeing to the financial extortion to save face. The second was that I would explode in defensive anger, creating a scene in a fine dining establishment. An explosion would prove her point to Diane that I was difficult, cold, and in need of familial guidance. I did not break down. I did not raise my voice, and I did not defend my character. I took a slow, measured breath. I swallowed the final sip of my sparkling water. I picked up my white linen napkin and deliberately dabbed the corners of my mouth. I placed my silver dinner fork down on the porcelain edge of my plate. I adjusted it until it rested precisely parallel to my silver knife. I turned my head to face my mother directly. I stripped all emotion, all inflection, and all defensiveness from my voice. "Just to be clear in front of our guest," I asked in a deadpan tone, "you are asking me to voluntarily sign the lease for Lexi." Brenda's chest expanded. She beamed, interpreting my calm question as the final flag of surrender. She believed her strategy had worked perfectly. Brenda smiled triumphantly. "Exactly, sweetheart." I reached down to the dark leather seat beside my thigh. My fingers brushed the smooth, stiff edge of the manila folder I had kept hidden since my arrival at the restaurant. I lifted the file and placed it squarely in the center of the table. The dull thud of heavy cardstock hitting the white linen tablecloth severed the mounting tension in the booth. I kept my posture relaxed. I did not lean forward, and I did not break eye contact with my mother. I adopted the exact vocal cadence I utilized during a fourth-quarter risk assessment presentation for a corporate board. "That is a fascinating request, Mom," I said. My voice was steady and quiet, carrying easily over the clinking of silverware from the adjacent tables, especially considering you already signed it for me. The temperature in our immediate vicinity seemed to drop several degrees. Brenda's triumphant smile froze on her face. The muscles in her cheeks locked, caught between the arrogant matriarch she was portraying and the sudden sharp confusion triggered by my statement. The ambient chatter of the surrounding diners faded into an indistinct blur. Diane, who had been sitting back with a look of detached amusement, shifted her posture. She leaned into the table, her sharp executive instincts fully activated. She recognized the pivot in the negotiation. Diane set her wine glass down on the linen, her eyes darting from the sterile manila folder to my face. She transformed from a polite dinner guest into a highly attentive observer. I opened the cover of the file. The crisp sound of paper turning echoed in our quiet corner. I pulled out the first document and slid it across the table, positioning the text so it faced both Brenda and Diane. It was the printed copy of the luxury lease agreement featuring the forged cursive signature resting heavily on the guarantor line. I directed my next words to the entire table, presenting the facts as a neutral third-party auditor. "Data leaves a digital footprint," I explained, gesturing to the printed pages with an open palm. When you input a Social Security number into a leasing application, it triggers an automated hard inquiry with the major credit bureaus. My security protocols flagged the request within 14 minutes of submission. I shifted my gaze directly back to Brenda. The color was rapidly draining from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, chalky hue. Her confident facade was crumbling under the weight of empirical evidence. It is a significant statistical anomaly, I continued, my tone devoid of anger. An authorized financial signature originating from an IP address located in a zip code the primary guarantor has not visited in 5 years. The probability of that being a legitimate transaction is 0. Brenda stared at the paper. Her eyes widened as she recognized her own handiwork printed in high definition. The illusion of her Democratic family vote shattered. She opened her mouth, searching for a way to regain control of the narrative. She desperately needed to minimize the severity of her action, especially in front of my senior director. "That is just placeholder paperwork," Brenda stammered. Her voice was thin, lacking its usual commanding resonance. She reached a trembling hand toward the document, her fingers hovering just above the page. "The leasing agent said they just needed a name to hold the unit. It is not an official contract, Alina. You are overreacting to a simple formality." I ignored the interruption. I did not debate the legal definition of placeholder paperwork, nor did I validate her weak defense. I treated her excuse as irrelevant background noise. I simply reached back into the manila folder and extracted the second document. I laid the single-page spreadsheet next to the lease agreement. The grid was immaculate, printed in stark black ink. I smoothed the edges of the paper, preparing to walk the table through the underlying math of our family dynamic. "Let us review the historical data," I said. I pointed a finger to the top row of the spreadsheet. 5 years ago, a joint savings account containing $40,000 was liquidated to fund a suburban down payment and a lakeside wedding venue. That capital was designated for my education and my early career foundation. It was reallocated without my consent. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. He refused to look at the spreadsheet, keeping his gaze fixed firmly on his half-empty water glass. He preferred ignorance over accountability. I moved my finger down to the next section of the printed grid. If that $40,000 had remained in a standard index fund yielding a conservative 8% annual return over the past 60 months, it would have generated significant compound interest. The lost opportunity cost is substantial. You did not just take my savings, you took the subsequent growth and the future security it provided. I tapped the final row on the page, highlighting the bolded numbers at the bottom of the column. "Now we arrive at the current demand," I stated, tapping the paper for emphasis. "You are asking me to absorb a luxury lease carrying a liability of $36,000 a year. You propose this transaction to benefit an individual who has already defaulted on a home mortgage, resulting in a bank foreclosure." I looked across the table at Lexi. My sister sat frozen, her iced coffee forgotten. The unearned arrogance had vanished from her features. She was unaccustomed to being evaluated as a metric. In her mind, she was the perpetual protagonist facing unfair hardships. On my spreadsheet, she was a stark liability. "This is not a family dispute," I told the table. "This is an ongoing systematic financial drain by an entity with a 100% default rate. There is no viable return on investment here. You are asking a statistician to fund a guaranteed loss." The blunt clinical assessment of her life hit Lexi like a physical blow. She realized that her usual tactics were useless in this corporate setting. Without the ability to argue logic, she deployed her most practiced weapon. She began to cry. It started with a soft whimper. Lexi's lower lip trembled, and tears pooled in her eyes, spilling over her dark mascara. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with performed fragility. For her entire life, these tears had functioned as a universal currency. Whenever she made a poor decision, she cried, and my parents rushed in to shield her from the consequences. She expected the weeping to derail the conversation. She expected Diane to feel uncomfortable and intervene with sympathy. She expected me to fold under the pressure of public emotion. I watched my sister cry. I did not reach across the table for a napkin. I did not offer a comforting platitude. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt. I felt the profound, settling peace of a person who no longer pays the emotional toll of a rigged bridge. I let the sound of her sobbing fill the booth for a long moment, forcing Brenda and Tom to sit in the uncomfortable reality of their creation. Diane watched the performance with a neutral, unbothered expression, taking a slow sip of her wine. I leaned back against the leather upholstery and addressed my sister directly. Tears do not alter the data, Lexi. Lexi's weeping failed to produce the desired effect. In the past, those tears functioned as an immediate override switch, halting any logical discussion and redirecting all attention to her comfort. My mother, sensing the failure of her preferred tactic, decided to escalate the engagement. If sorrow could not bend my boundary, Brenda would attempt to shatter it with sheer volume. She slammed her hand flat against the table. The sudden impact rattled the silverware and caused the water in our crystal goblets to slosh over the rims, staining the pristine white linen. Heads turned from nearby tables. The quiet hum of the upscale seafood restaurant fractured. A waiter holding a tray of oysters paused mid-step, his eyes darting toward our booth. Brenda did not care about the public disruption. She thrived on it. In her mind, whoever made the most noise won the argument. "How dare you sit there and humiliate your sister in front of company?" Brenda hissed, her voice, climbing into a shrill, piercing register that cut through the dining room. The performed maternal warmth she had aimed at Diane earlier evaporated, revealing the frantic, controlling core underneath. "You bring out a spreadsheet to insult us. You sit there and calculate compound interest while your own flesh and blood is facing homelessness. After everything we have done for you, Alina, you are choosing money over your own blood." It was her classic script recited verbatim from the playbook of familial guilt. The irony of her accusation was palpable. She claimed I was choosing money while she had literally stolen my money to fund the very sister crying beside her. I did not point out the hypocrisy. Arguing with a manipulator about their flawed logic is a futile endeavor. It only gives them more emotional fuel to burn. I focused entirely on the facts. I leaned forward slightly, shifting my posture to command the center of the booth. I remained the calm eye of the storm she was trying to conjure. "I am not choosing money, Mom," I corrected softly, my voice contrasting sharply with her rising pitch. "I am choosing my legal identity over a felony." I reached into the manila folder for the third and final time. My fingers grasped the thick, textured paper of the official municipal document. I pulled it out and placed it directly on top of the forged lease agreement and the financial spreadsheet. I rotated the page so the official header faced my mother. In the top right corner, the blue ink of the precinct stamp stood out against the stark white background. It was the police report for identity theft and fraud, officially filed and logged into the criminal database just a few hours prior. I slid the stack of papers across the table until they rested mere inches from Brenda's dinner plate. "Let me explain the mechanics of your decision," I said, maintaining the clinical precision of a data analyst dissecting a failed protocol. "When you typed my name onto that guarantor line, you committed forgery. When you submitted my social security number to a corporate entity to secure a high-value lease, you committed identity theft. Because you transmitted that fraudulent data across state lines to a company operating in Washington, you introduced federal wire fraud into the equation." Brenda stared at the blue stamp. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The shrill indignation died in her throat. She looked like a driver who had just realized the bridge was out long after pressing the accelerator. "Identity theft carries strict penalties." I continued lecturing the table with a cold, unyielding cadence. "The law does not recognize a family vote as a valid defense for financial crimes. It recognizes mandatory minimum sentencing. Furthermore, the property management company has a robust fraud department. They take these matters very seriously to protect their own assets. They already flagged the digital footprint of the application. The IP address used to submit the fraudulent lease matches the residential router located in your living room." I paused to let the geographical reality sink in, watching her process the information. "You left a clear, undeniable data trail leading straight to your own front door," I stated. "The authorities do not need to hunt for the perpetrator. You gave them a map." The silence that followed was profound. It was not the tense, expectant quiet of an argument waiting to resume. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a structure collapsing upon itself. The illusion of my mother's matriarchal power shattered instantly. For 28 years, she had ruled our household through a potent mixture of emotional intimidation and manufactured obligation. She operated under the belief that her title as a parent granted her immunity from the consequences of her actions. She thought her guilt trips were a universal currency. Facing a stamped police report, she discovered her currency held zero value. You cannot emotionally manipulate a prosecuting attorney. You cannot cry your way out of a digital footprint. The justice system operates on evidence, not on familial hierarchy. I shifted my gaze to Diane. My mentor sat rigid in the booth. Diane had spent her entire career fighting tooth and nail to secure her position in an industry that actively tried to push her out. She had sacrificed her time, strategized her career moves, and earned every promotion through relentless competence and long hours. Looking at Brenda, Diane did not attempt to hide her overt disgust. The tech executive saw a woman trying to steal the hard-earned stability of a younger professional simply to coddle a lazy sibling. Diane picked up her wine glass. Her eyes locked on Brenda with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. The public shaming Brenda had intended for me had reflected straight back onto her destroying her reputation in front of the exact person she had tried to impress. Next to Diane, my father finally looked up from his plate. Tom stared at the police report, the blue ink dragging him out of his intentional ignorance. For decades, Tom had enabled his wife by staying silent. He read the sports section while she drained my savings. He watched television while she forged my signature. He believed that if he did not actively participate in the schemes, he bore no responsibility for the damage they caused. He thought neutrality was a safe harbor. The blue stamp eradicated his neutrality. He realized in real time that his wife had crossed a severe legal threshold. His passive silence could no longer protect her from the fallout. If the charges were activated, the police would arrive at the house he owned. The scandal would rip through his quiet suburban life, destroying his standing in their community. Tom looked at Brenda, his face pale and stricken, understanding that the peaceful retirement he envisioned was currently balancing on the edge of a criminal indictment. Lexi stopped crying. The performance ceased the moment she comprehended the actual stakes of the situation. She wiped her eyes, her mascara smudged across her cheeks, staring at the paperwork with wide, fearful eyes. She had wanted a luxury apartment with a concierge and a secure garage. She had not bargained for a criminal record. She slowly edged away from Brenda in the booth, creating a small physical distance between herself and the primary suspect. Her loyalty to our mother evaporated the second it became a legal liability. Brenda sat frozen in the center of the wreckage. Her mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a fish pulled from the water and tossed onto the dry planks of a dock. She searched her repertoire for a rebuttal, a counterattack, or a tearful plea that would restore the old dynamic. She searched for the words that would make me fold, apologize, and hand over my credit card. She found nothing. The emotional leverage she had relied on for my entire life was gone. She could call me selfish, she could call me cold, and she could accuse me of abandoning my blood. None of those insults held any power against the verified data sitting on the table. I had stripped away the subjective drama and replaced it with objective consequences. I sat back in my chair and observed my family. They were cornered by their own arrogance, trapped in a cage they had built with their own hands. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply waited for the reality of their situation to finish settling over them. They needed to understand the depth of their peril before I dictated my terms. Brenda's mouth closed, snapping shut, as the reality of the stamped document sank into her awareness. The silence in the restaurant booth stretched thick and suffocating, contrasting sharply with the clinking of fine silverware and low jazz music playing in the background. When rage fails to break a boundary, a cornered manipulator will inevitably retreat to their final, most reliable defensive mechanism. Brenda began to cry. These were not the soft, performed tears my sister had attempted earlier. These were heavy, gasping sobs of sheer panic. Brenda covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving beneath her bright floral dress. She leaned across the white linen tablecloth, reaching out to grasp my wrist. I pulled my arm back, letting her fingers grasp empty air. I refused to offer the physical comfort she sought. "Alina, please," Brenda wept, her voice trembling and wet. "I was just desperate. Lexi was losing everything. I could not bear to see her out on the street." You have to understand a mother's desperation. I did not mean to hurt you. I just wanted to help your sister. Please do not send me to prison. Please do not file those charges against me." I watched her perform without an ounce of sympathy. I felt the steady, calm rhythm of my own pulse. Growing up, Brenda had used my empathy as a limitless resource, withdrawing comfort whenever she caused a crisis and demanding it whenever she faced accountability. But empathy requires a foundation of mutual respect to function properly. Without that foundation, the well runs dry. I looked at the tears streaming down her cheeks, ruining her carefully applied makeup, and saw nothing but a tactical maneuver designed to evade legal consequences. Her sorrow was not for the crime she committed, it was for the penalty she now faced. I signaled the waiter with a subtle nod and handed him my premium credit card to cover the dinner bill. Diane stood up from the booth, retrieved her structured black trench coat, and offered me a silent, respectful nod before exiting the restaurant. My mentor understood that the corporate portion of the evening had concluded, and she had witnessed exactly how I handled hostile negotiations. "We are leaving," I told my family. The ride back to my Bellevue high-rise took 20 tense minutes. We traveled in a heavy, oppressive quiet inside the private car service. The Seattle rain drummed steadily against the roof of the vehicle. Brenda continued to sniffle into a tissue, dabbing at her eyes. Tom stared out the tinted windows at the passing city lights, his jaw clenched tight. Lexi kept her arms crossed firmly over her chest, staring at the rubber floor mats. I sat in the front passenger seat, tracking the route on the navigation screen, fully in control of the transit. We rode the elevator up to the 17th floor. The hum of the mechanical cables was the only sound in the confined space. When we stepped inside my condo, the contrast between the chaos they brought and the pristine environment I had built was stark. I did not invite them to sit down on the white leather sofa in the living room. I remained standing in the entryway, holding the sterile manila folder flat against my side. "The identity theft charges are currently pending," I stated calmly, breaking the silence. My voice echoed slightly off the hardwood floors. "They are not active yet. They remain pending under one condition." Brenda looked up, her eyes red and swollen. A flicker of hope ignited in her expression. She thought a negotiation was opening. She believed she could barter her way out of the felony by offering future promises or emotional apologies. She was mistaken. I was not offering a discussion. I was dictating the terms of their surrender, with the cold authority of a presiding judge delivering a sentence. "You will walk into the guest room right now and pack your bags," I instructed. "You will place every item you brought into your suitcases. You will leave my home tonight. You will take a taxi to the airport, and you will wait there until you secure a flight back to your own state. You will never contact me for financial assistance directly or indirectly ever again." Tom shifted his weight, opening his mouth to speak, perhaps to ask for a reprieve until the morning, or to suggest they find a hotel nearby to rest. I cut him off before he could form a single syllable. "These terms are non-negotiable." I continued, my gaze sweeping across all three of them. "If a single credit alert triggers on my monitoring service, the police report goes active. If you attempt to contact my employer, my mentor, or anyone in my professional network, the police report goes active. If you send a relative to harass me, or if you attempt to spread a fabricated story about me to our extended family to save your reputation, I will press the charges and I will testify in federal court. Do you comprehend the math of this arrangement?" Brenda nodded slowly. The realization finally sank in that her power was permanently broken. She had gambled her freedom for Lexi's luxury comfort, and she had lost the bet. Lexi, however, had not fully grasped the reality of the new paradigm. Stripped of the premium apartment she had been promised, and facing a midnight eviction from my guest room, her entitlement flared up one final time. She stepped out from behind our mother, her face twisted into a petulant scowl. "This is entirely unfair," Lexi whined, her voice echoing in the minimalist hallway. "My marriage is over. The bank took my house. Where am I supposed to live, Alina? I have nowhere to go. You cannot just throw us out into the street in the middle of the night. You have a second bedroom right here. You could easily let me stay until I get back on my feet. I am your sister." I looked at her. I analyzed the decades of unearned privilege that had molded her into a person who demanded bailouts while contributing zero effort. She still believed that my surplus belonged to her. She still thought my stability was a communal asset meant to cushion her failures. She expected the safety net to materialize simply because she demanded it. "You have parents who funded a lakeside wedding and a substantial down payment," I replied. My tone remained flat, devoid of anger or pity. They invested $40,000 into your foundation. You squandered it. Move into their basement. That equation is balanced. Lexi recoiled as if she had been struck across the face. The truth of her situation offered no comfort and no alternative route. She looked to Brenda for a defense, but our mother kept her eyes trained on the floor. Brenda could not fight for Lexi's living arrangements when her own criminal record was suspended by a single thread. The protective shield Lexi had hidden behind her entire life was gone, leaving her exposed to the harsh elements of consequence. I did not wait for further arguments. I turned my back on them and walked the short distance to the front door of my luxury condo. I gripped the brushed steel handle and pulled the heavy door open. It swung wide, revealing the brightly lit empty corridor of the 17th floor. I stood beside the open frame. I did not yell. I did not point my finger toward the elevators or hurl insults about their character. I simply waited. The physical act of holding the door open served as the ultimate boundary. It was a silent, unarguable eviction from my life and my sanctuary. The gesture required no translation. The era of my financial subjugation was over-finalized by the simple geometry of an open exit. My family stood frozen in the entryway for a long, agonizing minute. They waited for me to soften to let out a sigh to tell them they could sleep in the guest bed just for tonight. They searched my face for any trace of the obedient, capable daughter they had manipulated for 28 years. They found a statistician holding a manila folder guarding a perimeter they could no longer breach. The silence stretched until it became unbearable for them. Finally, Tom turned around. He walked down the hall toward the guest quarters, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Brenda and Lexi followed him, their footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. They began packing their belongings. The sound of zippers closing and luggage wheels shifting drifted out into the main living space. I kept my hand on the door handle, feeling the cool metal against my palm. The conflict had reached its terminal point. The variables had stabilized. I listened to the sounds of their departure, knowing that the next phase of this transaction would redefine our power structure forever. I remained stationed by the open front door. The brushed steel handle felt cool against my palm, a solid anchor in the shifting currents of my home. Down the hall, the guest room served as an incubator for the impending fallout. The sounds of their hasty departure drifted into the quiet living room. Zippers snagged on overstuffed fabric. Hangers rattled against the wooden closet rod. Heavy footsteps paced back and forth across the carpet. I listened to the frantic rustling, recognizing the distinct acoustics of panic. For my entire life, Brenda and Lexi had operated as an impenetrable coalition. They shared a symbiotic relationship where Brenda manufactured the safety nets and Lexi provided the eternal crisis to justify them. That alliance relied on external funding. Without my surplus, to absorb the shock, their toxic ecosystem had nothing left to consume but itself. The psychological breakdown materialized before they even reached the entryway. Lexi emerged from the hallway first. She dragged a heavy designer suitcase over the threshold, the small wheels grinding harshly against my pristine hardwood floors. Her mascara remained smeared under her eyes, but the performed sorrow had morphed into sharp, frantic terror. Lexi had spent 28 years insulated in golden child armor, protected from the sharp edges of reality. Facing actual legal consequences for the first time in her adult life, stripped that armor away in a matter of minutes. She turned around and blocked the narrow passage, refusing to let our mother pass. Brenda stumbled to a halt, clutching her own expensive leather travel bag. "This is your fault," Lexi spat. The venom in her voice was a startling departure from her usual fragile tone. She pointed a manicured finger directly at Brenda's chest. "You told me this was a guaranteed solution. You said you had everything handled. Filing a forged application was your stupid idea. Now I have a police report hanging over my head." Brenda recoiled, her eyes wide with shock. The betrayal from her favored daughter hit her harder than any spreadsheet I could ever present. Brenda had risked federal charges to secure a luxury suite for Lexi, expecting boundless gratitude in return. Instead, she was receiving a vicious indictment. "Do not speak to me in that tone," Brenda snapped. The maternal warmth she usually reserved for Lexi vanished, replaced by a defensive biting edge. "I took a risk to save you from living in a slum. I did what I had to do because you cannot manage your own life." The argument escalated rapidly, bouncing off the stark white walls of my corridor. I stood in silence by the door, observing the interaction with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a volatile chemical reaction. Lexi shoved her suitcase forward, forcing Brenda to step back. "I cannot manage my life because you micromanage everything I do," Lexi cried. "You filled out that application. You typed her signature. If Alina presses those charges, I am going to tell the police exactly who sat at the computer. I am not going to jail for your terrible decisions." The threat of exposure fractured the final pillar of their codependency. Brenda stared at Lexi, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. The realization that her golden child would gladly offer her up to the authorities to save herself broke Brenda's restraint. "You are an ungrateful brat," Brenda hissed. She gripped the handle of her travel bag until her knuckles turned white. "I have sacrificed my entire retirement to fix your mistakes. If you were capable of holding down a marriage or keeping a basic budget, we would not be in this situation. You lost the house we bought you. You chased away your husband. Do not blame me for trying to sweep up the mess you create wherever you go. I watched the snake eat its own tail." The foundational myth of our family dynamic dissolved right there in my hallway. They had spent decades blaming me for being cold, insisting that their chaotic enmeshment was proof of deep familial love. Stripped of my financial buffer, they revealed the truth. Their bond was not built on love. It was built on mutual exploitation. The moment the resources dried up, they turned their teeth on each other. Tom walked out of the guest room, navigating around the two bickering women. He carried his dark canvas garment bag over one shoulder. My father looked exhausted, his shoulders bowed under the invisible weight of the scene unfolding in front of him. He walked past Brenda and Lexi without saying a word, effectively abandoning them to their bitter dispute. He stopped just short of the open front door, pausing beside me. Tom looked at my face, searching for a trace of the little girl who used to beg for his intervention. He found a grown woman who no longer required his protection. The silence between us stretched for a long, heavy moment. He gave a small, slow nod, a gesture of profound defeat. "I'm sorry, Alina," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper, against the backdrop of the argument behind him. It was the only apology I would ever receive from him. It was incredibly brief, far too late, and entirely pathetic. He was not apologizing for allowing the theft of my savings. He was not apologizing for standing by while his wife forged my signature. He was apologizing because he had lost the comfortable peace he had purchased with my subjugation. I did not offer him forgiveness, and I did not offer him cruelty. I accepted the apology for exactly what it was. I nodded back. Tom stepped over the threshold, walking out into the brightly lit corridor without looking back. The sound of Tom's departure finally severed the argument in the hallway. Brenda and Lexi stopped shouting, turning to realize that my father had left them behind. The isolation settled over them. They were stranded in a hostile environment, devoid of allies and devoid of leverage. Lexi grabbed the handle of her heavy designer suitcase. She refused to make eye contact with me. She dragged the luggage over the hardwood, the wheels squeaking loudly, and scurried out the door, eager to escape the suffocating pressure of accountability. She hurried down the corridor toward the elevators, leaving our mother to face the exit alone. Brenda stood in the center of my entryway. She looked around the pristine, minimalist space she had tried so hard to conquer just hours earlier. Her attempted takeover had resulted in her permanent exile. She gathered her oversized travel bag, her movements stiff and uncoordinated. She walked toward me, her heels clicking against the floorboards. I kept my hand on the steel handle of the door, holding the exit open. I maintained a neutral, unbothered posture. Brenda paused at the threshold. Her pride required one final attempt to inflict pain. She needed to land a parting shot to salvage a fraction of her shattered dignity. She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing with a bitter, toxic resentment. "You have no heart," Brenda hissed. Her voice shook with suppressed rage. "You care more about your numbers than human beings. You threw your own family out into the rain over money. You will die alone in this sterile box with your spreadsheets." I listened to her curse. I analyzed the words, searching for any emotional resonance within myself. I found none. Her insult was a projection of her own deepest fear. Brenda was terrified of being alone, which is why she trapped her family in a web of financial and emotional debt. I did not fear solitude. I welcomed the quiet predictability it offered. I looked at my mother. A genuine, relaxed smile spread across my face. It was the first authentic expression I had shown her all evening. "At least the math will be honest," I replied. I pushed the heavy door forward. Brenda took a quick step back into the corridor to avoid being struck. I watched her face disappear behind the closing frame. The heavy wooden door shut with a solid, satisfying thud. I reached up and turned the deadbolt until the locking mechanism clicked into place, sealing the barrier. I stood alone in my entryway. The air inside my condo felt remarkably clean. The chaotic energy had been filtered out, leaving behind a profound stillness. I took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of rain and my own expensive citrus room spray. I turned away from the locked door and walked back toward the dining area, ready to address the final variable remaining in my home. I turned my back to the heavy wooden door and took a slow breath. The atmosphere inside the corridor had physically shifted. The suffocating pressure that my mother and sister brought with them had evaporated into the quiet hum of the building's central air system. I walked back down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the runner rug. I prepared myself to face the final remaining variable in my home. Diane was still seated at the dining table. My senior director had not called for a car, nor had she quietly slipped out the back exit during the chaotic eviction in the entryway. She sat perfectly relaxed against the leather upholstery of the circular booth. She held a crystal wine glass by the stem, swirling the remaining Sauvignon Blanc with a steady, rhythmic motion. The dining room around her was a landscape of abandoned dinner plates, crumpled linen napkins, and the physical remnants of a shattered familial illusion. I felt a rare spike of professional anxiety pierce my usual calm. I had spent years cultivating a pristine reputation at my firm. I was known for my flawless risk assessments, my predictable metrics, and my unwavering composure under tight deadlines. Tonight, I had exposed my primary mentor to a hostile domestic dispute. I had brought the messy, irrational reality of my toxic relatives directly into the corporate sphere. I approached the table and folded my hands in front of me. I adopted the formal posture I used during performance reviews. "I owe you a sincere apology, Diane." I began, keeping my tone respectful and measured. "You accepted a dinner invitation under false pretenses. I deeply regret that you were subjected to that disruption. It was highly unprofessional, and I assure you that the situation has been permanently neutralized." Diane did not nod in agreement. She did not offer a polite platitude about how families can be difficult. Instead, she raised her free hand, palm facing outward, instructing me to stop speaking. She set her wine glass down on the table. Diane was a veteran of the Pacific Northwest tech industry. She had navigated the ruthless dot-com boom, survived countless corporate restructurings, and built her executive career in boardrooms dominated by aggressive personalities. She evaluated human behavior through a strict lens of efficiency and leverage. "Do not apologize to me, Alina," Diane instructed. Her voice was smooth, carrying the undeniable weight of a seasoned leader. "I have sat through executive board meetings where adult billionaires cried over far less. I have watched grown men throw temper tantrums over decimal points and market share." She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the white linen tablecloth. Her sharp eyes met mine, offering an unexpected glimmer of profound respect. "I watched you handle that table," Diane continued. "You did not raise your voice once. You did not let them drag you into an emotional debate. You brought receipts, you established a secure perimeter, and you neutralized a hostile takeover with exceptional precision. That was one of the most effective displays of leverage management I have ever witnessed." Diane reached for the chilled bottle of wine resting in the silver bucket. She poured a small measure into her glass and then gestured toward the empty seat across from her. I sat down in the booth, absorbing her assessment. "In our industry, we constantly deal with bad actors trying to exploit system vulnerabilities," Diane said, lifting her glass into the air. "Your mother identified your empathy as a vulnerability. She attempted a hostile acquisition of your assets. You patched the vulnerability and evicted the threat. I am raising my glass to you." I picked up my water goblet and tapped the rim against her crystal glass. The clear chime rang out a stark contrast to the harsh, discordant noise Brenda had made earlier when she slammed her hand on the table. This interaction solidified the profound cultural contrast I had recognized when I first moved to Washington. If this dinner had occurred in my hometown, the surrounding community would have condemned me. The local church circles and the neighborhood gossips would have labeled me a cruel, ungrateful daughter for refusing to subsidize my sister. They would have rewarded Brenda's tears and punished my logic. In my chosen world, however, the metrics were entirely different. In the high-tech meritocracy of Seattle, emotional manipulation is correctly identified as a liability. Logic, accountability, and strict boundary setting are the traits that earn respect. Diane did not view my actions as cold. She viewed them as necessary and highly competent. She validated the exact qualities my family had spent 28 years trying to suppress. My analytical nature was not a flaw. It was my greatest asset. Diane finished her wine, offered a final nod of approval, and gathered her structured black trench coat. I walked her to the door, thanked her for her time, and watched her step into the elevator. When the metal door slid shut, I was finally alone in my sanctuary. The adrenaline that I had carefully suppressed throughout the evening began to dissipate, leaving a heavy exhaustion in its wake. I turned my attention to the dining room. The physical act of cleaning has always served as a grounding mechanism for me. It is a process of restoring order to a disrupted environment. I gathered the discarded plates, scraping the remnants of the seared halibut and wild mushroom risotto into the disposal. I carried the crystal glasses to the sink. I turned on the faucet, letting the hot water run over my hands. The warmth seeped into my skin, chasing away the lingering chill of the confrontation. I dispensed a measured amount of soap and began washing the dishes. I scrubbed the porcelain surfaces with deliberate rhythmic motions. As I worked, I looked over at the kitchen cabinets. I remembered Brenda standing on her tiptoes earlier that afternoon, presumptuously rearranging my mugs and plates to suit her own preferences. She had tried to imprint her control onto my physical space. I had reversed her changes then, but now I felt a deeper sense of reclamation. The air in the condo belonged to me again. The quiet belonged to me. I dried the dishes with a clean cotton towel and returned them to their precise designated locations on the shelves. I wiped down the quartz countertops, removing any trace of the evening. I carried the sterile manila folder from the dining table into my home office, locking it securely inside my filing cabinet. The paperwork had served its purpose, transforming a potential catastrophe into a managed event. With the kitchen restored to its pristine condition, I walked into the living room. I turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the soft glow of a single floor lamp. I stepped up to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the sprawling Seattle skyline. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean. Thousands of lights twinkled across the grid of streets and high-rise towers. In the dark, the urban landscape looked like an immense server rack. It was a vast, complex network of energy and information, steady and reliable. The city was processing data exactly as programmed indifferent to the irrational demands of individuals who refused to follow the rules. I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the window. The storm had passed, and my fortress had held. I had defended my borders against the most intense incursion my family had ever mounted. Yet, as I watched the ferry boats glide silently across the dark water of the Sound, a new subtle tension began to form in my mind. The immediate confrontation was over, but the variables were not entirely resolved. Brenda and Lexi were currently sitting in an airport terminal, humiliated and enraged. A cornered threat does not simply evaporate. The police report remained in a pending status, acting as a tripwire. The true test of my perimeter was not the initial battle. The true test would be the quiet weeks ahead. I had to monitor the data streams, waiting to see if my mother's desperation would override her fear of federal prosecution. The silence in my condo was a victory, but it was also a new, untested baseline that required constant vigilance. 6 months elapsed, 182 days of uninterrupted equilibrium passed without a single deviation. In the realm of statistics, a 6-month trend line lacking any erratic spikes signifies a highly stable environment. I sat at my home desk on a crisp Tuesday morning in November, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The Seattle rain traced steady, predictable paths down the floor-to-ceiling windows. I logged into my primary credit monitoring portal to perform my weekly audit. The dashboard loaded instantly, displaying a soothing array of green icons. I had 0 unauthorized accounts. I had 0 hard inquiries. My credit score had actually climbed another 12 points. The digital perimeter I established on Mother's Day remained pristine and unbreached. The sterile manila folder containing the stamped police report rested undisturbed in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I never had to activate the felony charges. The mere threat of empirical consequence had proven sufficient to deter further incursions. The strict boundary held firm. My knowledge of my family's current status came strictly through secondary, unsolicited sources. The quiet grapevine of my hometown occasionally reached across the country, usually transmitted by my cousin Sarah. Sarah was a neutral observer, a pragmatic woman who managed a local bakery and monitored the town dynamics with a detached amusement. She called me on a Sunday evening to share the inevitable results of my financial withdrawal. Without my surplus income to act as a shock absorber, the structural integrity of my parents' household had collapsed exactly as I predicted. Lexi was forced to move into Brenda and Tom's unfinished basement. The reality of that transition was a harsh correction for my sister. The former golden child accustomed to imported tile and luxury amenities was now sleeping surrounded by cardboard boxes of holiday decorations and humming water heaters. Her designer suitcases looked ridiculous, resting on cold concrete floors. The cramped quarters produced severe friction. Sarah described the environment as a pressure cooker. Without my bank account to fund her distractions, Lexi had no escape from her own failures. Brenda, deprived of her preferred scapegoat, directed her controlling tendencies entirely onto Lexi. The two women engaged in endless bitter infighting, tearing their toxic alliance apart from the inside. Tom, as always, retreated further into his recliner, choosing the cowardice of silence over mediating the disaster playing out beneath his floorboards. Brenda attempted to execute a secondary strategy to regain control. She tried to spin a narrative of victimhood throughout their suburban community. She attended local social gatherings and church events, portraying me as a cruel, heartless elite who abandoned her struggling family for the selfish pursuit of corporate wealth. She wanted the town to rally around her, offering the sympathy she used as currency. The strategy failed. A smear campaign requires an active target to sustain momentum. Because I resided 3,000 miles away and maintained total silence, Brenda had no fresh material to feed the rumor mill. I offered no defensive statements for the town to dissect. I provided no dramatic reactions for them to judge. Without the physical proof of my presence to project her insecurities onto the local audience, quickly lost interest in her perpetual tragedy. They grew tired of hearing the same fabricated grievances week after week. The community recognized that a mother who constantly disparages her successful, independent daughter often reveals more about her own toxic nature than the daughter's character. Brenda found herself increasingly isolated, left alone with the bitter reality of the basement dweller she created. Sitting in my Bellevue high-rise, I processed this information without a trace of guilt. Society conditions women to feel inherently responsible for the emotional temperature of their relatives. We are taught to interpret our own peace as a form of theft, as if feeling secure means we have stolen comfort from someone else. I unlearned that conditioning. I realized a profound weightless lightness in my new baseline. When you stop paying the rent of forced gratitude to toxic people, you finally discover the true cost of those relationships. The energy I previously expended anticipating their demands, managing their crises, and enduring their insults was returned to me in full. It was a significant influx of mental capital, and I reinvested every drop of it into my own trajectory. The results materialized rapidly in my professional sphere. Diane called me into her corner office during the final week of the fiscal quarter. She reviewed my predictive models and the risk assessment protocols I had implemented over the past year. My algorithms had saved the firm a substantial amount of capital by identifying high-risk investments early in the cycle. Diane did not offer empty praise. She presented a new employment contract. The firm promoted me to the position of Senior Director of Predictive Analytics. The role came with expanded authority, a dedicated team of junior analysts, and a steep increase in compensation. I signed the document with the same steady hand I used to sign my property deed. The math of my life was compounding at an exceptional rate. I decided to celebrate the promotion by making a physical alteration to my sanctuary. For years, I kept the walls of my condo a stark, clinical white. The lack of color reflected my need for a sterile, controlled environment. I needed to ensure the space was clean and devoid of chaotic variables. With my perimeter secure, I no longer required a sterile environment. I desired a space that reflected my internal calm. I purchased several gallons of premium interior paint in a deep, rich shade of oceanic blue. I spent an entire weekend moving my minimalist furniture to the center of the rooms, taping the baseboards and rolling the color onto the walls. The physical labor served as a grounding exercise. With each stroke of the roller, I claimed the territory not just legally, but emotionally. When the paint dried, the condo transformed. The deep blue absorbed the ambient light, creating a soothing, immersive atmosphere. The space felt anchored, intentional, and profoundly safe. My daily routine settled into a rhythm that many people might describe as mundane. I woke early, drank my coffee overlooking the sound-executed high-level corporate strategies, and returned to my blue sanctuary. My life became boring in the best possible way. It was predictable, it was profitable, it was entirely my own design. I dictated the variables and I reaped the rewards. The narrative of my extortion seemed permanently closed. I had neutralized the threat, secured my assets, and built a reality impervious to their manipulation. I believed the equation was balanced forever. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, I walked down to the lobby of my building to check my designated mailbox. Amidst the usual assortment of utility bills and glossy corporate catalogs, I found a singular, anomalous item. It was a thick envelope, forwarded multiple times through the postal system, bearing a postmark from my hometown. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. The looped, sharp cursive belonged to Brenda. She had discovered that digital communication and financial fraud were blocked, so she resorted to a physical, tangible incursion. I stood in the brightly lit lobby holding the thick envelope in my hand. The weight of the paper suggested a lengthy document, perhaps a final manifesto of guilt, a legal threat, or a desperate plea for a new concession. The quiet predictability of my afternoon vanished, replaced by the immediate necessity of processing one final physical variable that had slipped through the defenses. I stood in the brightly lit lobby, turning the thick paper envelope over in my hands. The heavy cream cardstock carried the distinctive loops and sharp angles of Brenda's handwriting. She had bypassed the digital blockades I erected and resorted to the postal service. A year ago, the sight of this mail would have spiked my cortisol. It would have triggered a cascade of anxiety, a desperate mental rehearsal of whatever defense I needed to mount against her inevitable demands. Now, holding the physical evidence of her persistence, my pulse remained steady. I viewed the envelope not as a threat, but as a final desperate data point in a closed study. I walked into the stainless steel elevator and pressed the button for the 17th floor. The doors slid shut, sealing me in a quiet, ascending metal box. I did not tear the paper open in a frantic rush. I waited until I stepped inside my condo. The deep blue walls of my sanctuary absorbed the afternoon light, offering a silent, reassuring welcome. I set my keys on the console table, walked past the clean kitchen counters, and carried the letter into my home office. I sat at my desk and used a silver letter opener to slice the top edge of the paper. I extracted 5 pages of densely packed cursive. The blue ink was pressed hard into the paper, a physical manifestation of her frantic energy. It was a masterclass in emotional extortion, a perfectly structured algorithm designed to generate guilt and manufacture compliance. I read the text with the clinical detachment of a senior analyst grading a deeply flawed corporate proposal. Brenda utilized every classic tactic available to an exposed manipulator. Paragraph 1 deployed heavy nostalgia referencing childhood holidays and fabricating a history of maternal warmth that never existed in reality. Paragraph 2 pivoted to intense victimhood. She detailed the miserable conditions of living with Lexi in the unfinished basement, describing the damp air and the constant arguing that plagued their daily routine. She painted herself as a martyr, suffering the unfair consequences of a fragmented family. Paragraph 3, buried near the bottom of the 4th page, contained the inevitable request. She framed it as a temporary bridge loan. She asked for a modest sum to repair a vehicle, claiming the transportation was vital for Lexi to secure employment and eventually move out. It was the exact same equation repackaged with slightly smaller variables. The luxury lease extortion had failed, resulting in a pending felony charge, so she downgraded the request to a car repair. The core dynamic remained untouched. She still viewed my income as a communal asset waiting to be tapped. She still believed that presenting a problem obligated me to provide the financial solution. I read the final sentence, folded the pages together, and experienced a profound sense of closure. The letter confirmed everything I already knew. People who rely on toxic enmeshment do not learn from boundaries. They simply probe the perimeter, searching for a weaker entry point. They change the scenario, but they never change the intent. I did not draft a response. I did not place the letter in the sterile manila folder with the police report. This document held no legal weight and required no strategic retention. It was just noise. I fed the 5 pages into the heavy shredder beneath my desk. The machine whirred to life, its steel blades reducing my mother's carefully crafted guilt trip into a pile of illegible paper ribbons. The physical incursion failed to penetrate my peace. The transaction was voided. I want to step out of the timeline for a moment and speak directly to you. If you are watching this, you likely understand the specific gravity of a family dynamic built on unearned obligation. Society invests a tremendous amount of effort conditioning us to believe that shared genetics require infinite sacrifices. We are taught to view our own stability as a selfish pursuit if our relatives are struggling, even when their struggles are the direct result of their own chronic negligence. You must reject that conditioning. You have to rewrite the formula. The core philosophy of my journey, the mechanism that saved my future, relies on 2 fundamental truths. Boundaries are not cruelty, and silence is not surrender. When people who are accustomed to utilizing you as a resource realize you are closing the account, they will accuse you of being vicious. They will label you as cold, heartless, and arrogant. You must understand that their accusations are not an accurate reflection of your character. Their insults are a tactical response to losing their supply. They rely on the noise of guilt to distract you from the facts of their theft. They want you so focused on defending your morality that you forget to check your wallet. The moment you remove the emotion from the interaction, the dynamic shifts entirely. Treat their demands like raw data. Evaluate their requests the same way you would evaluate a high-risk investment portfolio. Look at the historical returns. If a relative has a 100% default rate on your generosity, you are not helping them by providing more capital. You are simply funding your own depletion. When you treat their emotional outbursts as irrelevant background static, their power evaporates. You stop playing their game, and you force them to exist in reality. I walked out of my office and headed toward the kitchen. The rain continued to wash the city windows, the Seattle skyline glowing through the gray, overcast afternoon. I opened the upper cabinet to my right. My ceramic mugs sat in perfect alignment exactly where I preferred them. I reached up and selected my favorite mug. It was the exact same cup Brenda had presumptuously moved to the top shelf during her ill-fated visit, the physical token of her failed attempt to establish dominance in my territory. I placed the mug under the espresso machine and pressed the button. The rich, dark coffee filled the ceramic, warming the surface against my palms. I leaned against the quartz countertop, taking a slow, grounding sip. The taste was bitter familiar and highly satisfying. I want to ask you a final question. If you have been the designated shock absorber for someone else's bad decisions, what is it costing you? Calculate the time, the energy, and the financial resources you have surrendered to keep the peace in a household that only values you for what you can provide. Look at the balance sheet of your relationships. Do the liabilities far outweigh the assets? Comment data over drama below if you are ready to freeze your emotional credit. Let today be the day you stop financing your own disrespect. You are allowed to protect your assets. You are allowed to paint your walls whatever color brings you peace. You are allowed to lock your front door and refuse entry to the people who only bring chaos into your sanctuary. When I was 23 years old, sitting at that chipped veneer kitchen table in my hometown, my parents looked at my empty bank account and offered a justification for their theft. They told me I was smart. They told me I would have to manage on my own. It turns out that was the best financial advice they ever gave me, because I did manage. I built the algorithms, I navigated the risk, I secured the perimeter, and I forced the variables to balance. They thought my independence meant I required nothing, but my independence meant I required a standard they could never meet. And now I own the board. That is my story. One stolen savings account, one forged signature, and the cold, unarguable logic that protected a future. Thank you for listening to Still. If you found value in this breakdown, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next one.
There is a quiet, unspoken contract woven into the fabric of the traditional American family. It is an agreement built on the promise of nurturing, of launching the next generation from a secure foundation, so they might reach higher than the ones who came before. We meticulously fund savings accounts, we chart out educational paths, and we proudly uphold the ideals of self-reliance and independence. Yet beneath the polished surface of suburban life, and the curated facades we present to our neighbors, a darker dynamic often takes root. When we examine the story of Alina and her family, we are forced to look into a deeply uncomfortable mirror. Her journey is not merely a tale of a stolen savings account or a forged lease. It is a profound reflection on the laws of cause and effect, the danger of toxic attachment, and the devastating consequences of decoupling love from wisdom. In our culture, we frequently confuse love with the removal of struggle. We see a child stumbling, and our deepest biological instinct is to catch them before their knees hit the pavement. But as Alina's mother, Brenda, so tragically demonstrated, blind love is not a cure. It is a slow-acting poison. In the pursuit of protecting her favored, fragile daughter, Brenda committed an act of profound ignorance. She justified the draining of Alina's future to sandbag Lexi's present, mistakenly believing she was acting out of maternal devotion. True compassion, however, can never be separated from profound understanding. Wisdom in parenting requires the agonizing courage to step back. It is the realization that clearing every obstacle from a child's path does not make them safe. It renders them defenseless. By forcing the capable child to constantly pay the debts of the irresponsible one, a parent does not create harmony. They engineer a cruel, unnatural injustice that breeds deep-rooted resentment. Love without wisdom is merely a smothering embrace that ultimately breaks the very child it seeks to protect. This brings us to the erosion of fundamental family morality. In traditional structures, the word family is meant to signify a sanctuary of fairness, honesty, and mutual respect. Yet, how often is that sacred word weaponized? Brenda and Tom use the banner of blood relations to rationalize the darkest of ethical breaches. They committed theft by liquidating a promised future, and they committed fraud by forging a signature on a luxury lease, all while hiding behind the justification that family shares the blessing. This is a heartbreaking reality in modern society, where the concept of morality is twisted into a tool for emotional extortion. Ethical parenting begins with the absolute respect for the personal boundaries of adult children. A child is brought into this world through you, but they are not your property. They are not an extension of your ego, nor are they a communal asset to be liquidated when another branch of the family tree begins to wither. True moral guidance is demonstrated through living an upright, honest life, offering a template of integrity rather than treating a capable child as a limitless line of credit. The most striking lesson from Alina's quiet war is the true nature of resilience. Real strength is not born in the comfort of a fully funded lifestyle, nor does it grow under the heavy shade of overprotection. Resilience blooms from the cold, hard dirt of reality. Alina's response to profound betrayal is a masterclass in emotional awareness and inner stillness. When faced with theft, fraud, and a public ambush, she did not allow herself to be consumed by the fire of anger or the chaos of sorrow. She anchored herself in undeniable truth in data and in the law. She possessed the profound inner stability to watch her family attempt to manipulate her, and she responded with the clinical precision of a boundary that could not be moved. Conversely, look at the fragility of those who have never been allowed to fail. When confronted with the consequences of their actions, Brenda and Lexi possessed no internal fortitude. They resorted to tears, screaming, and shifting blame. This is the ultimate tragedy of the helicopter parent. By robbing a child of their adversity, you rob them of their resilience. An overprotected child becomes a fragile vine desperately searching for a structure to cling to, collapsing the moment the support is removed. A child who is allowed to face the storm, to feel the wind, and bear the weight of their own decisions grows into a mighty tree, with roots driven deep into the earth. If we are to find genuine peace within our own homes, we must turn the lens inward and commit to the hard work of self-correction. For many parents, the root of familial dysfunction is not malice, but ego. The desperate fear of losing face, of having the neighbors realize that the perfect family portrait is cracked, drives people to desperate controlling measures. To heal, we must lower the ego. We must accept our family's flaws rather than constructing elaborate fraudulent facades to hide them. Furthermore, we must practice the art of letting go. The fundamental law of life is impermanence. Nothing remains static, and we cannot shield our children from the world forever. Releasing control means allowing adult children to bear the weight of their own actions and face the natural consequences of their choices. It requires cultivating a quiet mind, responding to family crises with clarity and stillness, rather than being swept away by panic greed or the desperate need to manage everyone else's narrative. Peace does not arrive when you finally force the world to obey your will. Peace arrives when you accept the truth. Relinquish your selfish attachments and allow the people you love to walk their own paths, even if that path leads them away from you. These are the quiet, difficult truths that shape the architecture of our lives. If you find value in these reflections in the unvarnished reality of how we navigate the turbulent waters of kinship and boundary setting, we invite you to subscribe to Still Drama Stories. Join us as we continue to explore the profound strength it takes to hold your ground. As the dust settles on Alina's story, one cannot help but look at the silent rooms of their own home. We all play a role in the delicate ecosystem of our families. The question that lingers in the quiet hours of the night is not just about what we have given to our children, but what our giving has cost them. When you look at the dynamics you have nurtured, the boundaries you have drawn or erased, and the love you have dispensed, are you cultivating deep, unshakable roots? Or are you simply tying vines to a crumbling trellis? The answer, much like the truth, rarely announces itself loudly. It just waits for you to finally notice it.